Super. Well, hello. Welcome to this webinar co-organized by TESS, that's the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, by the IISD, by CUTS International Geneva, and by the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, entitled Greening Aid for Trade, Future Priorities and Pathways for a Just Transition to Sustainable Trade. This is, of course, part of the 2022 Global Review on Aid for Trade. My name is Alice Tipping, and I lead work on trade policy at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and I will be one of your two moderators for this evening's session. So there are three keywords in the title of today's event: green, aid for trade, and the just transition. And these really are the three axes around which our discussion is going to focus. Now, the first two of those terms might be quite familiar to aid for trade discussion, which many of you will be part of. The third concept may be a bit less so. So the third idea here, which is very ably expressed in a brief that's written by Carolyn Dia-Birkbeck, which she was going to speak to a bit later on, is to understand how important it is that aid for trade respond to and be shaped by developing countries' own views of how they want to achieve a transition towards sustainable trade. So we're really going to be looking at this issue in particular from their perspectives. So in order to structure this interesting discussion, we're going to hear from representatives of developing countries. We have the honor of being joined by Ambassador Blackman from Barbados, the permanent representative of Barbados to the World Trade Organization, from Ambassador Pinacha, who is the permanent representative of Pakistan to the World Trade Organization. And they will each explain from their own national perspectives the importance of aid for trade in moving towards more sustainable economic practices and a better relationship between trade and economic activity and the natural environment. We're then going to hear from Yasmin Ismail, who is a program officer at CUTS International in Geneva, who's going to help to outline exactly how aid for trade might be shaped to enable this transition. Ambassador Simon Manley, the permanent representative of the UK to the World Trade Organization, is going to help us understand how this change and how aid for trade's role might best be monitored, which is an important role in a particular important perspective to hear from a large donor country. Carolyn Dia-Birkbeck, one of our co-hosts, is going to talk about how crucial it is that we keep listening to developing countries in shaping aid for trade and listening to their perspectives about the transition they would like to undertake. And Stephen Stone from the United Nations Environment Programme here in Geneva is going to help us understand how partnerships can help to shape this support so that it achieves a fair transition towards sustainable trade and economic activity that bears a more sustainable relationship to its natural environment. So we have a fantastic lineup of very interesting speakers addressing a very interesting perspective. And perhaps to illustrate just how well partnerships can work, I'm delighted to introduce, at long last, my co-moderator. Rashid Kaukab is the Executive Director of CUTS International Geneva, and I'm going to offer him the floor now for his own opening remarks, and then to move straight into our panel discussion. So Rashid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alice, for very clear, succinct, and yet comprehensive and substantive introduction. And thank you for introducing me as well. It's a pleasure to co-moderate this with you and co-organize with wonderful partners of TESS, IIST, and FCDO. I will say just a few words after the excellent introduction, substantive introduction by Alice, and then we will proceed with the panel. And of course, my very sincere thanks to all the panelists and very warm welcome to all the participants. I can see there are already about 40 there. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on wherever you are joining us from. In this initiative, like future priorities and pathways, like any worthy initiative, any effort that is made, three questions are really important. Why, what, and how? I think why question is of course very important, but critically important are also what is it that can be done and how that should be done. And that's where, as Alice said, it is really important that this is not a top-down approach. That is where those who are on the ground, like in developing countries, they know their problems, they know what they're facing, they know what they need, and we need to listen to them. Also, instead of having a bifurcated, fragmented approach, very important that we bring different stakeholders together. So it is not just in developing countries. Of course, the development partners are equally important, and so are the NGOs and think tanks. And that is reflected in the composition of this panel as well. As Ella said, we have 3 ambassadors. So we are very fortunate, despite their being very busy. We could have 3 of them, 2 from developing countries, 1 from a developed country. But also we have a think tank like Caroline. I mean, she wears many hats. So, but expert, researcher, think tank, and then of course we have from UNEP, a very important intergovernmental organization. And finally, we have a speaker from CARTS, an NGO working on these issues. So this is our practical way of bringing these stakeholders together to reflect on these questions of why, and particularly what and how. And we are hoping that through this discussion, we will have some more clarity, we'll make some progress, we will identify some elements to work towards a just transition. So with these words, let me also just supplement that the way we intend to run this session, we have a total of 90 minutes. So as Alice mentioned, each speaker we request to remain within 6 minutes or so. Then we would like to have some time for question, answers, and discussion. And then at the end, time permitting, all of the panelists may have 1 minute each to say any final words that they would like to say. Keeping in mind that sometimes have a way of running faster than we realize. So we would encourage that the participants, if any question is coming to their mind, they don't wait for that window of opportunity. There is Q&A function, which is functioning here for all participants. So you can start putting in your questions there. As Alice said, the speakers may respond to that in writing as well. And we can take up whatever remains towards the end while maintaining the time limit of these strict 90 minutes. So with this, a bit of the flow of the session, let me turn to our first speaker. Alice and I will be introducing them respectively. We will do it briefly for the sake of time. All of them are, I think, quite well known, and it's a pleasure to have them here. So let me start. Our first speaker is going to be Ambassador Blackman. He's Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Barbados to the UN, WTO, and other international organizations in Geneva. He has an illustrious career from law practice, consultancy in international trade and development, but then for our present session, he chairs the SIDS group in UNCTAD, the Small Island Developing States group. He's also the Americas coordinator for the governmental group in the ILO, is a UN International Gender Champion, and last but certainly not the least, which makes him most relevant to be in this panel today, is he has chaired both the Committee on Trade and Development and Committee on Trade and Environment in the WTO. That makes him eminently suitable to answer the question, being from a small island developing state, having dealt with both environment and development issues. So Ambassador, I'm going to start with you. And the question that we have for you is that, can you share your thoughts about how can aid for trade be used to strengthen climate resilience and readiness of trade, as well as adaptation of trade, because the climate shocks are already being felt. So both these aspects of climate resilience of trade, as well as the role and how can it be used to face climate adaptation. And of course, you can expand on that in any way that you would like to. So Ambassador, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rashid, and good afternoon and good evening to all of you, wherever you are. Firstly, before I start to put my presentation into context, to address the question that you just raised, I really want to say that in every crisis, there's an opportunity somewhere, and we have to see how can we match the two. And therefore, I think it's an indisputable fact that trade concept and initiative certainly can be a key contributor to a country's transition to sustainable trade, and also serving to bolster climate resilience and trade readiness, adaptation to changing climatic conditions, recovery from climate shocks. Now, conceptually, if a trade is aimed at assisting developing countries, and in particular, least developed countries, to build their trade capacity and infrastructure necessary for trade to take place. Now, traditionally, that has been measured as an element of official development assistance, ODA, in including as it relates to grants and concessional loans, as it is targeted at trade-related programs and projects. Now, as the impact of climate crisis intensifies, so too does the need to move toward more climate resilient trade, adapting to changing climatic conditions, as well as the propensity to recover from climate shocks. Now, soon, as countries enhance their commitments at the international and national levels, there is an increased need to move towards more sustainable trade. Now, the concept of transiting towards sustainable trade that generates equitable social and environmental outcomes, or just transition, is an urgent global priority. And I think that based on the fact that our discussion today focuses on greening trade and setting out priorities and pathways for a just transition to sustainable trade, this is something that we can all agree on, at least conceptually. We must be cognizant that this type of transitioning can require major shifts in economic models for many countries. Depending on their level of development, countries may have a lot of complex processes that they have to undertake to achieve that. Now, generally, there will be a need not only to mainstream environmental objectives in international trade and strategies, but into projects, budgets, including aid for trade projects. Now, this is necessary if adaptation challenges are to be addressed and countries are to take advantage of sustainable trade opportunities. In order for this to happen, it is my view that we need to secure a new and additional set of resources for environmental related aid for trade activities. Simply reallocating existing resources will not suffice. In so doing, there is a need to ensure that aid for trade, particularly that which is trade and environment related, reaches those most in need. Excuse me. We are faced with a situation today where only 15% of all climate finance is going to countries that are on the front line of the climate crisis and that are truly vulnerable. There are a number of smaller and developing states, like my own, that have contributed minimally to greenhouse gases and emissions. They are classified as high vulnerable and that are consistently on the front lines of the climate crisis. Yet, they have little to no access to concessional grants or loans, and therefore little to no hope to enhance their climate resilience, and significant limitations on their ability to recover from the confluence of that impacts these economies, largely because of the criteria of granting such types of resources. Therefore, reforms were necessary if aid for trade is to work for a greater number of developing and least developed countries, particularly as they seek to enhance climate resilience and readiness of trade, as well as adaptation in the face of changing climatic conditions and recovery from climate shocks. Now, as a first step, there needs to be an acknowledgement of a definition of climate vulnerability to access concessional funding. Secondly, and importantly, reconsidering the eligibility criteria for grants and concessional loans and enhance access to overseas development assistance to go behind per capita income matrices is therefore critical. Thirdly, there is a need for a rationalization of and improving access to climate finance to ensure that countries who need it most receive a fair share. And fourthly, it is the need for an increase in the number of countries that can benefit from debt relief and long-term debt restructuring. We need new and creative long-term financial instruments to finance pandemic and climate debt. And for the debt that we must continue to raise both of them, if we are not to crowd out the investment, we must make the achieving of the SDGs possible in that regard. Now, to close, there's tremendous scope for the WTO, including through the Committee on Trade and Environment, of course, as well as the informal dialogue on plastics pollution and sustainable plastics trade. Take forward discussions on promoting an aid for trade agenda that supports developing and least developed countries and their harnessing opportunities in sustainable trade, influencing and employing and adapting to trade-related environmental requirements and regulations, as well as bolstering climate resilience and trade readiness, building climate resilient trade-related infrastructure, and lastly and importantly, to boost access to additional resources of finance and investment. Thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Blackman. I'll pick up the moderation. And I think you're underlining in particular of how many of the world's most vulnerable states are not those who have been responsible for the climate change that we're all facing. I think and the importance, I think what that suggests to me is the importance of making sure that adaptation to climate change is as much part of the climate change discussion as mitigation is. And I think that's a really important concept to keep in my head. And in our heads as we go forth. So thank you very much for that contribution, which is an extremely good way of leading into the rest of this discussion. So I'm delighted now to give the floor to Ambassador Mujtaba Piracha. He is, of course, as we've said, the permanent representative of Pakistan to the World Trade Organization. But I have to add that he brings to this role also very deep experience that's very relevant to this discussion. He's worked in leadership roles in regional government in Pakistan, but he also holds a PhD from the Institute of International Development Studies at Sussex University. So, Ambassador, we'd be delighted to hear your perspective, perhaps about how, in your view, aid for trade projects can support efforts in developing countries to harness the potential of circularity to generate sustainable development outcomes. This is it's very much a hot topic in the discussion at the WTO, but is one I'm sure that's come across your desk as you've gone along. So if you'd like to focus on this concept of circularity, that might be an interesting theme to inject at this point. But sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alice, and good evening to everybody. Thank you for having me. So I'd try to sort of speak to the question and also at the same time the three key words that were handed down earlier, but green, aid for trade, and just transition, and emphasizing the just. So the framework that I normally sort of peddle on these issues of global commons is basically framed in a prisoner's dilemma. Then the four boxes of the prisoner's dilemma that we all know that are used for global commons issues, that you'll only come to an optimal outcome if you work in a cooperative mode rather than a competitive mode. And with the pandemic, you might have closed borders and gotten over part of it. But with climate change, I'm afraid that is not possible. So you really have to put your actions and put your money where your mouth is to be cooperative and not get sucked into a competitive mode. So for the first step, I think that greening of aid for trade or greening of the economy and how it can, in terms of circularity and the circular economy, how it can all come together is, I think, and I give the example of Pakistan throughout this, that is, I know mostly about, is that it should not be assumed that there is no circularity that already exists in developing countries. I think that is the key message that I want to give today. Circularity in the case of Pakistan, and I know a lot of developing countries, exists not because of any sensitivities to sustainable economy, but because of poverty, because of paucity of resources. So the throughput is perhaps much less per capita than, it is much less per capita than developed countries or richer economies. So this paucity has resulted into a traditionally circularity where your cardboard, papers, plastic, glass bottles would get collected from your home by roving collectors on bicycles who would pay you for that collection. And my memory goes back to 45 years of this, and I'm sure it was there. And I think this example would reverberate with other developing countries also. But that's one example. In Pakistan, even now, you have no graveyard of cars, of refrigerators, of anything, of electronics. It simply does not exist. It is repaired, it's put back into use, it's resold huge secondhand markets where people from lower income groups access these so-called luxury items. Thirdly, even when it comes to trade, we have a business of huge containers coming off junked electronic items. It started with one country and one supplier from Japan. container loads of these things and multiple containers every month, which was sold in markets where you could pick up anything and go and get it fixed and use it. So what it does is it gives employability at very low basic level and skill development, because people can fix literally anything. So sometimes, I mean, there's also a very nascent, plastics industry, which uses used plastics, melts it, remolds it to other stuff, which is kind of organized, but the collection part of it is still very, very informal. So the other key thing that I want to tell or put across is that this all exists in an informal environment. It's not counted as part of the GDP. It's not formal. Having said that, I mean, in some of these economies, 40, 50, up to 60% of the economies are sometimes informal economies. Okay, so the recycling industry per se are not quoted in any GDP figure that you might pick up from most countries anyway. So it's not cataloged. These practices exist and they need to be studied is the first step when we move towards what to do with the aid for this kind of activity, this kind of transition. So which I would suggest that you go and do a deep dive into some of these practices, see with this aid money to put out studies, commission studies to study different practices in different countries, and then do a macro level analysis of what percentage of GDP they really are, and what areas or what sectors of the economy do they really cover. And then thirdly, what kind of business models are being employed and what are the value chains around these recycling or circularity within those sectors of subsectors. Moving on from that, I mean, once we have a clear picture of what's happening, and I think the similar thing should be done for developed countries if it's not done already, so that we have a comparator and some sort of metrics comparing where we are in what sectors and where we are going, because it is essential to know where we are to try to figure out how to get from A to B. So once a clear picture comes into mind, that might take a little time, and we ideally revisit what to do. But till that is done, there could be some simple evolving hypotheses that you could be working with, which is that this circularity that exists is mostly informal. It's mostly small and micro operations. They obviously lack funding, they lack organization, and they probably don't have a big business model to work with. These are very, very, but if you document it, it becomes an informal business model, doesn't it? It is low to no technology that is involved here. Okay, these are just initial hypotheses that we can work with. Lastly, and very importantly, that there would be very low absorptive capacity for any interventions that might be planned, because these are illiterate or very low levels of educational attainment that you're talking about, some of these people. So this would then constitute your target group, really, and this is not even provides an opportunity of what you're working with, but also a challenge, because you don't want to disrupt the economy of what is happening, and then that is I mean, my one sense is, although I work for the government, is like if something is happening, maybe you want to keep the government away from it. If you want to keep it happening well, keep the government away, don't bring in regulation, but they are not regulated, and there are issues with it also. We've had issues in our part where some of the plastics industries were using some of the waste from hospitals, and we had to crack down on that. And it turned out it was quite a big industry. On the other hand, you have existing business models, which are of bigger industries, although not perhaps in recycling. I know of one model where all the fast food oil, like from McDonald's and everything, was collected and taken to this one factory, which was then making biodiesel out of it and selling it back. There are also other models of moving towards solar panels. We had a big shoe factory outside of Lahore, and they produce basically for Germany. And the way the client is very sensitive, and they totally moved with their own money, and obviously technology is available, to solar paneling of the whole factory, and it was a very big operation. We also presented that case in the Trade and Environment Committee at one point. So the biggest challenges I foresee in this transition is that the developing countries might face is that you might have these very small but many actors, and it's an employment issue. They just might get smothered during any such transition, which might emanate through national or multilateral regulation, or even large multinational companies coming into this country. So it's a very fragile economy of this recycling. The second is that if the playing field is upset in some way, it's kind of linked to the first one. If the playing field is upset in some way, that recycled goods start displacing local industries in developing countries earlier in the game without getting a fair chance to adopt these recycling technologies. And I give here the example of the surgical instrument industry, which is a big industry in a city of Sialkot, which, by the way, produces these footballs also for the World Cup. And that is being threatened by some actors, some players in the world market. So if it's the transition, the interventions of the transition are not sequenced in the right way, and regulation comes in before you give people a chance to adopt or sensitize them, it might be problematic. To sort of wrap up, I would just say that Aid for Trade can help with the just green transition by documenting and disseminating the successes, and then building up from there. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Praja. Thank you for that very thought-provoking intervention. If I can try to over-summarize that, you made this very important point that for almost all developing countries, the important thing would be to recognize, to study, to document, to compare, and then share lessons for what has been happening for ages there in terms of circularity. And then, of course, certain aspects of that being basically employment and poverty-driven, informality, small size, a very unique business model, low technology. But that's where the work needs to start from. They may not have done it knowing the environmental implications, but that does exist, and that should provide a basis to scale up, to enlarge. And in a way, that was your second major point, that in this transition, for it to remain just all the others in that market should be given enough time and capacity and training and support, so that while creating one thing, the other does not get prematurely destroyed. I'm not saying that this is all that you said. I just was trying to listen to you very carefully, and this is an excellent point that you made. Now, moving to the third speaker on our list, who happens to be my colleague here, Yasmin Ismail, who is a program officer who would go, as has been our work, also a bit more into this how question. But let me introduce her briefly. She has worked for an international consultancy company in UK. Also, she worked for the government of Egypt. She has 2 master's degrees, and she has been working for us for more than 3 years now. Among her many interests are also e-commerce and gender, but she will talk about that some other day. So Yasmin, question to you. and this is much more at the how question, that is one of my favorite questions. How can we move forward on mainstreaming environmental consideration into aid for trade? And how can we ensure the redesign involved is meaningful for developing countries, which is, as Alice said right at the beginning, is this running theme, continuous theme for our session. So floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rashid. I hope you are able to see my screen for my presentation.
Yes, we are able to.
Perfect. I will try to be short. This presentation or my intervention will focus more on a suggested process and a few elements that we need to keep in mind when working on greening aid for trade and reaching a model for a green aid for trade. I wanted to start by I only at the beginning thought, do we have a definition for green aid for trade? And we don't. I like definitions so long that they are alive. We are able to review them, discuss them, but they also help put some frame for what we're talking about. And in my search, I also noticed what we acknowledged and Alice acknowledged at the beginning is that the narrative that we have on greening aid for trade is coming mostly from stakeholders in developed countries, which is understood, and especially also their development assistance agencies and civil society. And this is what is also acknowledged in one of the fourth series of a paper among the series of papers by Tess and written by Monkelban, Kian, and yourself, Rashid. So starting from here, if the narrative is mostly from developed countries so far, and what we're trying to do today is to bring the narrative from developing countries, I searched for the closest definition that we can sort of use to give some structure to the discussion. And I remembered the green growth definition by the OECD back in 2011. And I thought, let's do a preliminary attempt. What if we strike growth, replace it with aid for trade? And what if we strike economic growth and put trade instead? So that would read, green aid for trade is about fostering trade and development while ensuring that the natural assets continue to provide the resources and environmental services on which our well-being relies. To do this, it must catalyze investment and innovation, which will underpin sustained growth and give rise to new economic opportunities. And I thought this is a very preliminary attempt, but I hope it can bring some ideas to move forward. Now, part also from the paper by the fourth paper by Tess tackled the main pillars of the aid for trade: technical assistance, trade-related infrastructure, building productive capacity, trade-related adjustment, and other trade-related needs, and provided some insights into how can we translate those pillars or give them an environmental conceptualization, and to green those this conventional aid for trade definitions. For example, technical assistance for trade policy, it can be translated into support for environmental trade negotiations and discussions. Right now we have the informal groups discussions in the WTO, and there is need to voice developing countries into those discussions, so support to developing countries. Also, development of improved environmental regulations. Trade-related infrastructure, as Ambassador Blackman insisted on, the importance of having climate resilient infrastructure and renewable energy and the transition from fossil fuels, building productive capacity, support diversification, perhaps also study and try to understand if some of the developing countries have interests in green products. They might have offensive interests in their exports, for example, that can bring diversification for their economy. Trade-related adjustments or adjustment to green trade policies elsewhere, such as the border carbon adjustment that is being discussed by Europe now, and other regulations that are being now adopted by developed countries. Climate change and environmental standards are being more and more adopted, and meeting those standards can be challenging for developing countries for their even regular or traditional trade products right now. And finally, support for green recovery and also support to understand how trade policies can serve their national determined contributions in the UNFCCC. This provides like a preliminary framework, and I invite you to read this paper. However, the second part of the question addressed to me is how to ensure it is just, how to ensure that it will give developing countries what they need. And I think the process has two main risks, among others, of course. The first one is that so far we have a donor approach, which if we continue on this and we don't have forums like today, might lead to a lack of buy-in. So to mitigate this risk, as Alice said, a donor recipient, a participatory approach is very important for this process. And to reach it, we need donor countries and to build knowledge of developing countries in order for them to better define their interests and concerns. And then we need to involve developing countries more in those discussions in order to come up with an informed model that will respond to these interests and concerns. And finally, we need a process that allows constant review and constant consultation with developing countries so that ownership is embedded. And so that we have a model that is alive, that can be reviewed and adapted when needed. The second risk is related to that it might lead to additional burden for developing countries, which will compromise the concept of fairness that we talked about and that Ambassador Blackman also talked about. In environmental language in UNFCCC, it is acknowledged that developed countries bear the responsibility of the carbon imprint. And for that, they need to bear the financial responsibility for mitigating and adapting to climate change. So to ensure this risk is being taken into consideration, we need to find some balances here. A first balance is between this environmental responsibility needs to be met with additional financial resources. So greening aid for trade means additional financial resources for environmental purposes in trade. A second balance is that we need to, if the climate change impact on trade is increasing, as we said at the beginning of the discussion, then support for adaptation and resilience needs to be a core element of a green aid for trade. And a third balance needs to be found if we have additional criteria for developing countries to meet, whether to access green aid for trade or to monitor and keep record and improve and evaluate green aid for trade projects, then capacity building needs to be built. Those are the three balances that I think are very crucial for this process and for the redesigning to reach a green aid for trade model. I kept short, I think. Thank you so much. I invite you also to read our latest publications on climate finance and aid for trade, and another note on differential treatment of developing countries in the UNFCCC and WTO that we recently released by CUTS. Thank you so much.
Yasmin, thank you very much for that presentation. It was absolutely fascinating. And you presented so clearly the various concepts that we need to be thinking about as we discuss this concept of greening aid for trade, but also particularly thinking about the risks of the transition and the risks that this change of aid and funding policy might bring from a developing country perspective. So I'd encourage everyone who's reading this, who's watching this webinar, or who may be watching it later, to go back to the website and download those slides, because I will be. They were really fantastic at capturing, I think, what all of this discussion is about. So thank you very much for that. I think it was a perfect presentation to have sort of in the middle of this discussion.
Thank you.
No, it was wonderful. Thank you. We're going to move now perhaps to the how side of the discussion. And we're going to start with the perspective of Ambassador Simon Manley. Simon Manley is somebody who will be very familiar to many of us in the Geneva context. He is, of course, the UK's permanent representative to the WTO, but also to, I read, 35 other international organizations in Geneva, which gives him no time at all, I imagine, but also an extremely broad perspective on how the trade field relates to other areas of international cooperation. He's held more senior roles in the UK's diplomatic service than I can list here, but he also sits in a very interesting position in the WTO and his functions there, because he is the chair of the Committee on Trade and the Environment. Ambassador Manley, we have in our preparation asked you a rather specific question about how we can ensure that we are monitoring the right things in our aid delivery. But in fact, Yasmin's presentation was so interesting that I wanted also to invite you to react to some of the things you've just heard, because I thought it was actually very insightful. So there's an open invitation to react to what you've just heard, and also to answer the more specific question about how we make sure that we're monitoring the right things in order to manage them properly in our aid and donor relationships. So Ambassador, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Alice, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, 35 organisations in Geneva. Please don't ask me what they are. And also, I think what you really try to say is broad but shallow. So my apologies. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do a terrific job of pick up all of Yasmin's really good points. But there's one particular point I'd really endorse. It's about the sort of great slide, Yasmin, you had about kind of the process. And that process of, if I remember rightly, informing, involving, reviewing, consulting. And I think that's absolutely central to the way that we want to do business in this area of aid for trade. And I think that's something we should all be taking away and ensuring that we are doing effectively in our aid for trade programs. Look, if I could just kind of step back a second, Alice, to kind of start and to say there was a great article at the beginning of this week of this global review of aid for trade by the three great women, well, you're also the fourth great woman leading kind of all our efforts in this, but by Dr. Ngozi, Pamela Coke-Hamilton and Rebecca Greenspan, which set out some of a sort of big picture piece on what we're trying to achieve out of aid for trade. And I think what I took away from that was that sense of how we need to use aid for trade to produce a greener trading system, a more inclusive trading system, and a more connected trading system. And I think that picks up, to be honest, a lot of the points that my fabulous colleagues from Barbados and Pakistan have made about just transition as well, and the justice in this, and how you need to look at this from a holistic perspective. And I think for us, there is a really important role for trade and trade policy in underpinning the green transition. And that's about how we incentivize the uptake of green goods and services and technology. It's about how we make some of the most vulnerable countries on the planet. And Chad spoke very eloquently as ever about the challenges that countries like his face. How we help countries to become less vulnerable, to diversify away from those goods and services which make them or can make them vulnerable. And it's also about, obviously, encouraging efficiencies. And sometimes forget that, but it is about encouraging efficiencies which enable companies and countries to change the nature of their carbon footprint as we all try and move towards net zero. And so for us as a country and as a government, it's about how we put climate and the environment right at the heart of aid for trade and indeed of our overall development strategy. And you'll know, Alice, that we've kind of recently published a new international development strategy. And we say in that that both that strategy and indeed the British government's integrated review, which preceded it, reflect that our number one international priority has to be tackling climate change and biodiversity loss. That's quite interesting. Just to you have to pause on that for a second, because that is quite a change. Number one priority, British government, tackling climate change and curbing biodiversity, or reversing actually biodiversity loss. And that has a really practical effect. And this comes back, I think, to many of the points that Yasmin was making, that, as you say, a really excellent presentation about the how of this. And that means for us putting climate change and the environment right at the heart of aid for trade, right at the heart of our overall development strategy. And to pick up your very specific question, ensuring that we are indeed accurately capturing, reporting, analysing in exactly the sort of way that Yasmin was setting out the effect of our projects and programmes on climate change and the environment. And let me just kind of give you two very practical examples of that. We have something called the UK Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transition, UK Pact, where we're working, for example, with producers of cocoa and other forest commodities in Nigeria to improve sustainable international trade. In Kenya, we're delivering clean energy projects. And through the Challenge Fund of UK Pact, we are making funding available for projects that strengthen measuring, reporting, and verification tools for forests, for land use, and agriculture across Latin America and Asia. And I think that is trying to address exactly the question you set for me. Give you another example. The Sustainable Manufacturing and Environmental Pollution research program that we have going with UNCTAD under Rebecca's inspiring leadership. We've committed £25 million for that over the last few years. And that is supporting plastic pollution mitigation solutions across Ghana, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Kenya, and the DRC. As part of that program, we've built up interactive dashboards that combine economic, trade, product lifecycle analysis so as to provide both government and industry in those countries with key export pollution data for manufacturing sectors, 13 countries across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. More broadly, we have said, not just that we're committed, we can all say these kind of grand things, we're committed to aligning all of our ODA with the goals of the Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Climate Pact. We are. But for the first step, from 1st of April this year, each and every new and eligible programme is now required to apply shadow carbon pricing in its programme appraisal. Okay. Very practical example of how we're embodying these issues, these measurements in each and every project that we're running as a government. And I just add to that from a kind of WTO perspective. I think there is a real opportunity here to use our WTO monitoring in all of this and to ensure that we're all living up to it. Obviously, some really interesting work going on in the IDP on plastic pollution, on how we do that in that particular proposal, that particular initiative. We're obviously jointly developing an assessment survey tool that will be a means, we hope, of capturing existing aid for trade programs related to addressing plastics pollution. And I suppose the broader point I take from all of that, and this is about how we mainstream, use that ghastly word, how we mainstream these issues across the WTO, across UNCTAD, across the ITC, and across our own governments as donors and recipients. How we do this collaboratively, but how we look and employ a climate and environmental lens to all the projects that we're running and ensure that they are effectively contributing to our collective, collaborative effort to achieve net zero. And we need to do it quickly. That's the last thing I'll say. This is not something that we can spend the next 15, 20 years sort of perfecting, because the world will be lost to us if we don't do it now. So I think the discussions we've had this week and the work that flows from them is really essential. It's really timely, but most of all, it's really urgent.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador, and very grateful that you very valiantly took the question by Alice also to respond to Yasmin's point. I know, yeah, Alice has this wonderful, sweet, very persuasive way to ask any question from anyone. I have never seen anyone refusing to reply to her. So, but thank you so much for that. If I can briefly, you mentioned again a number of very good points. My main takeaway is that what emphasizes how to incentivize and how to encourage efficiencies. That is the key message, and that's where you give a number of examples and possible ways, taking examples from the UK, which I would both call the high top level as well as very practical level. At the high level, like you mentioned, that this new international development strategy and the top priority there, so that kind of influences all the action that will be taken pursuant to that. In there also ODA, that it will be aligned with the Paris Agreement goals. So this is very good examples of setting down very clearly what should happen. But then you also supplemented that with a number of examples on the ground, so to say, like work in Africa, Asia, Latin America, through UK Pact, Kenya Clean Energy Challenge Fund, forest land use, agriculture, you name it. And so all of these are concrete examples. And I'm sure that learning lessons from there, we would definitely, all of us can benefit to see that how is that being implemented, what can be the best practices, what can be replicated, what can be reformed further. So thank you very much. Now I will turn to our next speaker, Dr. Caroline Deer, who is joining us from Australia, down under. She's not literally down under, both in terms of being in Australia as well as being stuck in a basement. So Caroline, thank you very much. She's Director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, that is TESS. And she has done so much in her life, young life, and she keeps doing so much that I don't think I'm going to mention all that to you. But she is, in addition to being director of TESS, she's a senior researcher at the Graduate Institute of Geneva's Global Governance Center. She's an associate fellow of the Chatham House and senior research associate at the University of Oxford's Global Economic Governance Program. I can go on and on, but you got the gist of it. So Caroline, thank you very much for joining us. And if you can, because as Alice also mentioned at the beginning, that where she was quoting from a recent paper study by you, which goes into very much in the issues that we are talking about, which I know is a personal passion also for you, on which you have been working for a number of years. So would you like to share the main insights, conclusions, takeaways from that paper that goes into all the issues like aid for trade, greening, just transition, and then the questions of why, what, and how. So please, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rashid, and thank you also for the very kind introduction. So I will try and use my few minutes just to provide an update of some of the key findings and recommendations of the joint paper that IISD and TESS have published this week. So really what we're trying to do with the paper is to try and focus some attention in this year's global review on the environment-related challenges and opportunities linked to aid for trade, and to consider how best we can incorporate some of these challenges into an aid for trade agenda that's also squarely focused on the sustainable development objectives expressed by developing countries, and to focus on how aid for trade can support this really important issue of a just transition to sustainable trade. Now, in the paper, I'm just going to quickly look at a couple of the key findings or focus areas of the paper, and then really move on to recommendations for this week's review. So the first, as you've already gathered from this discussion, is that there really is growing traction and interest in this issue of green aid for trade. We see it in the new environment initiatives at the WTO on plastic pollution, and also on trade and environmental sustainability. But issues of environment-related trade capacity building arise across a range of WTO committees in discussions. And they were also, there's explicit call in the SDGs to boost support, aid for trade support for developing countries to help achieve the SDGs. So we've got good reasons to be talking about this topic. The second point, as Alice emphasized, is that need to listen more closely to developing country perspectives on this topic. And I think there is this risk, as Yasmin alluded to, that we end up with a green aid for trade agenda that's really defined only by, or primarily by think tanks or NGOs in developed countries that are rightfully focused on the challenge of green trade, but perhaps where there's a need for more emphasis on really how this plays out in developing countries and how we can support them to be competitive actors and protagonists in this shift to a greener global economy, one that they actually benefit from as well. So the other speakers have emphasized many of the environmental crises that developing countries face and their impacts on trade, and also the trade-related challenges they face in addressing these environmental crises in the context of their wider sustainable development priorities. So a key challenge is that while there's a great commitment of developed countries to provide capacity building and technical assistance, this is in a range of environmental agreements, trade agreements, and in the SDGs, there is a shortfall in the scale of assistance relative to the needs at hand. And we also know that some of the most vulnerable countries can't necessarily access the resources that they need to foster climate resilient trade and development. So one of the other issues we note in the paper is that there's a broad, very broad array of actors in this space, but limited coordination. You have some of the key multilateral actors that Ambassador Manley referred to, but you have a vast diversity of bilateral actors and subcontractors and a whole range of other international organizations who are active in different bits and pieces of this agenda. And yet at the same time, they're not very well coordinated, and nor is there a very widespread ownership and guidance of all of this assistance by developing countries themselves. So there's a shortfall in the channeling of all of this assistance to what developing countries themselves are identifying as their highest priorities. And the final point on this was that we also identified there's sort of a weak evidence base. So at present, the Aid for Trade initiative doesn't have an overall framework or policy on mainstreaming environmental goals. So while different individual donors and actors might have environmental policies or criteria or impact assessments to guide their lending, these are at the discretion of those individual donors. And these vary widely. In addition, donor approaches to describing and categorizing the scope of their aid for trade varies widely, which also means that you can have an over or under reporting of the degree to which projects have environmental purposes or implications. So in short, this means donors have different interpretations of what counts as green aid for trade. So you see some people citing that as much, anywhere between 25 and as much as 50% of aid for trade has green goals. we don't really have clear evidence to back this. So a closer look, a recent closer look at the actual projects and activities indicated that as little as 2% of the projects involved in aid for trade, or sorry, if the total value of the money spent on aid for trade actually has an explicit environment purpose. So just quickly in the paper, we do look at a sample of environment-related aid for trade opportunities and priorities that have been expressed by a range of different actors, both from the NGO sector in developed and developing countries, and also from an array of different governments and the research community. So I won't go through all of these now, but just to note that you have, I mean, and Yasmin mentioned several of these already, but one of the key ones is not only to integrate environment considerations into aid for trade, but also to integrate trade considerations into the much wider range of assistance that's available through ODA and climate finance, for instance, more broadly. Another key cross-cutting priority is to identify and promote opportunities for developing country exports of environmental goods and services as part of their export diversification strategies, and to support developing country producers to adapt to changing environment and climatic frameworks. On the thematic side, of course, there's a great interest in trade-related support for climate adaptation strategies, as well as mitigation, and to help countries gain affordable access to the technologies and finance they need to participate in supply chains for low carbon goods and to be competitive in green markets. There are many other points on that slide, so I'm just going to move on quickly to the last two, which is really what we see as the main thrust of the paper, which is around the pathways for harnessing aid for trade for a just transition. And here we had 6 main areas. The first is this one of looking at how we can mainstream environmental goals into the core of aid for trade. And here especially relevant are infrastructure projects that can have significant climate, nature or pollution impacts, as well as projects in sectors with high environmental footprints, such as agriculture, natural resources, and natural resources. There's also in the second box a need to ensure that aid for trade monitoring systems are improved and adequately capture and report information on what's actually happening in terms of the amount of aid for trade that's going to environmental purposes, and also its impacts on the environment where that's relevant. The third is to secure additional resources and improved access for environmentally related aid for trade in ways that are prioritized by developing countries. The fourth is to look at ways that we can integrate trade considerations into climate and environment funding initiatives. And the fifth is around strengthening South-South cooperation on sustainable trade. And this is something that's sometimes forgotten when we look in the Aid for Trade Global Review, because it doesn't capture all of the South-South trade. It tends to focus on South-South aid for trade. It focuses more on that from OECD countries. So we need to look more closely at what the flows are and what kind of experiences and best practices that developing countries may be able to share among themselves. And finally, a really key point is this one of fostering greater coherence between aid for trade and the wider sources of environment-related assistance and finance to developing countries. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. But just as I think my time is running out, just to focus on specific recommendations for the Aid for Trade Global Review this year, I think it would be excellent if governments could agree to an environmental review of aid for trade. And here the point is really to try and better understand the state of play. What's going on? What are the best practices? What kinds of criteria are countries using? How could we improve monitoring? And so on. The second is really to support country-led roadmaps for sustainable trade that would include aid for trade needs assessments. And here I think there will be really important to build on the many other kinds of national assessments that are going on. There's ones that the World Bank are doing, that UNEP is doing, that are done in the context of UNFCCC. We have many national plans, but I think it is important that countries can see for themselves a pathway to be active participants and to benefit from this shift to sustainable trade, because there's real economic returns from them where the opportunities lie and the challenges, not just in the near term, but in the longer term. I will skip to point 4, which is I think it would be fantastic if governments could agree to convene a joint session of the Committee on Trade and Development and the Committee on Trade and the Environment to grapple with the intersection of the work of those two committees. That could be a way of putting in place some of the ideas that Yasmin had about an ongoing process of looking at the intersections of these issues. We can also continue to foster discussion of aid for trade priorities in the member-led initiatives, such as the IDP and the TESD. And finally, a core proposal is to convene a summit on financing a just transition to sustainable trade in 2023. And here I move to the last slide, which simply provides a quick overview of the range of a sample of some of the relevant actors. If we really want to have a just transition to a green and inclusive global economy, we really need to connect the dots between the various sources of support for developing countries. So this is not only aid for trade, but also sources like the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility, the issue of trade finance for developing countries as relevant to sustainable trade, leveraging that for private sector investment, and also looking at the role of ODA, some of which may have perverse impacts on environmental goals and some of it may support, and also the issue of debt relief. And these are all part of the matrix of the financing that will be relevant for developing countries to really be players and in the sustainable trade agenda. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. I'm conscious there are some issues with my sound, so I'm pausing to make sure that I come through. And just to end, Caroline, that was fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Just to note, some of you may not have seen all of Carolyn's slides, but I'm informed by the organizers they'll be both sent to you and made available on Tessa's website afterwards. So you'll get the benefit of all of the ideas in visual form, as well as having Caroline walk through them. But Caroline, thank you. I wanted to pick up on maybe the last point that you raised in that, which was about coordination. And it's been a pleasure to put all of these ideas together with you in the policy brief. And many of you will also see that in the chat box, there's a link to the policy brief, which is now available online, the shorter version of it. And there'll also be a longer report, which is in the publication pipeline now. So what you have now is really sort of the useful, very succinct version, and the longer report comes in a few days. But I wanted to pick up on this last point about coordination, because that's sort of the perfect segue, in fact, into our last and very important speaker. So again, somebody who's very familiar for those of us who've been working on the link between trade and the environment over a number of years, Dr. Stephen Stone has in fact worked at UNEP since 2010, and he's also spent a number of years at the Inter-American Development Bank. So has, I think, an extremely practical sense of how development works in regions and on the ground. Stephen is very much an economist. He holds a PhD in resource economics from Cornell University. But what I'm going to ask him now isn't so much about economic theory, it's more about his role as the Deputy Director of UNEP's Economy Division. And the question that we'd put to him, and I won't add any more in at this hour of the night, but the question that we'd put to him was how international organizations like UNEP, who will be central to this discussion, how they can work with the WTO and the Aid for Trade mechanism towards this just transition towards sustainable trade and sort of and economic practices that are in balance with nature. Are there challenges that you foresee in this cooperation, which may already be happening? And perhaps how can some of those challenges be overcome? So Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Alice. And congratulations to the organizers, to Kutz, Rashid, to you, and to our colleagues at IISD. Indeed, partnerships solve complex problems, and I don't know of any more complex problems than the climate challenge or the nature loss challenge that we mentioned up front. And I might add also the pollution challenge, what at UNEP our executive director calls the triple planetary crisis of climate instability, nature loss, and rising levels of toxicity and pollution. And of course, trade is part of the solution set. It could be part of the problem set, it could be part of the solution set. 1/3 of GDP is traded, at least, and more, with dips and rises during lockdowns and these kinds of things. Partnerships are key to solving complex problems. So just to start off, really happy about our partnership with Tess, Carolyn, with the Graduate Institute of Geneva. And our work also, I might say, Ambassador Manley with UKRI and the WCMC at Cambridge University, a lot of partnerships coming together to work with countries to solve these very difficult issues. There's a couple of things that I wanted to touch on in terms of aid for trade specifically. I am a bit of a neophyte to this area. My background is on economics and environmental economics in particular. But when I look at where we are this moment in time, particularly on the pollution question is at front and center in my mind because of the International Negotiating Committee for Plastics, which was kicked off at the UN Environment Assembly in March of this year, February, March of this year, moving towards a plastics treaty, which is a really interesting segue from that conversation that started at the WTO some years ago on trade in plastics and plastics pollution. So a very immediate application for the whole issue of building capacity is capacity to discern what is a product that has value and what is a liability that's looking for a destination. So the whole plastics question, and the fact that this is now on the table in terms of negotiating with the open-ended working group, I think makes it very timely to keep that conversation open across the WTO space, the Environment and Trade Committee, under your leadership, Ambassador Blackman, and the conversation which is happening, hosted by the UNEP Secretariat for governments to begin negotiating the outline of what a plastics treaty might look like. And of course, that has very important spillover effects for the trade community. There's another one we touched on, which is nature. Of course, a lot of trade has major nature footprints, and that's some of the work that we've been doing actually with the monitoring center, the World Monitoring Conservation Center, WCMC in Cambridge, which is looking at the trade footprint of different commodities. And here, there's a lot of interest around this, I would say, from the French government, from the UK government. There's a rising consciousness that consumption patterns in high-income countries can have very negative effects in lower-income countries that are producer countries. And so how do you look at that? How do you build that capacity to build resilience across those two spaces? Going back to the point that you made, Rashid, earlier, and I think Yasmin made, which is this is a conversation, right? This is a conversation about priorities in higher income countries, in lower income countries that are wrestling with very similar problems. And the last, of course, is climate, right? Climate instability. And Ambassador Blackman, I think you and your Prime Minister has put it more eloquently than almost anyone can. Your countries are on the front line of a situation which you didn't create, and yet you're facing the immediate impact. So how does that actually work? How can trade build resilience over time? This was the focus of a partnership report that UNEP did with WTO several years ago, looking at trade and resilience. So can trade actually become a motor for resilience over time? And here again, building capacity through mechanisms like Aid for Trade, which occupy a huge proportion of ODA spending, a very, very large proportion. I was really surprised to see almost 25% of ODA, so very large numbers. Can these resources be used to build climate resilience in countries? And I guess the last point I want to make here, Rashid, is the point around definitions. I've heard this several times tonight from Ambassador Piracha from Pakistan. I heard this very interesting panorama which you painted, Ambassador, about a nascent informal economy, which is already hard at work and very circular because out of necessity. So paucity of resources creating circular systems, which are very labor intensive and very resource efficient. But I also heard about the need to bring in those voices from those countries which are on the front line of climate change. And so how can Aid for Trade actually build those capacities over time? And I think, again, coming back to the main point, it is through partnerships. And one last example I want to share with you tonight is the technology mechanism. Through the UNFCCC. There's a climate and clean technology center based in Copenhagen, which actually is devoted to responding to demands for building capacities and transferring technologies for environmental goods and services that help to mitigate and to adapt to climate change. So I think there's a lot of tools on the table. I think it's very timely. The paper from Tess looks like a very good one with some very good recommendations, Carolyn. the environmental review of aid for trade, and the summit that you also mentioned. We'll be looking at this space very carefully. And thanks again for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. Over to you, Rashid.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for that very clear presentation and for remaining within time. So thank you very much. And I very much liked, I'm sure all the participants must have, that you very effortlessly and coherently weaved your presentation on the points that have been made by other speakers also. So that helps us all in getting an overall sense of this session. So thank you very much for that. Your key points, of course, the importance of partnerships, which you described in several ways, the climate change, pollution, major challenges for humanity, and then, of course, for all of us, trade can be part of the solution and it can be part of the problem. I guess all the effort and aid for trade, the redesign, whatever, is essentially to see that it does not become part of the problem, but remain part of the solution. And then, of course, I'm very glad that you brought in the technology mechanism under UNFCCC, because that, I would say, again, a concrete example of what we have been hearing in different ways from different speakers, and which Caroline very eloquently called, of course, she said it perhaps in a slightly different context, connecting the dots. So technology mechanism, that also has a role to play. We need to look at holistically at this challenge, because the challenge is too big to be addressed by any one organization, any one government, any one individual alone. So with this, we are coming towards the end. I can see that there is one question that have been put there. Has the speakers read that? It's rather a long question. I can read it. When we are speaking about greening aid for trade, we can not only talk about climate adaptation and mitigation measures. Circular economy, resource efficiency, and clean production are also important for developing countries and LDCs to boost their further growth. But greening of the economy and its digitalization demand huge investments and relevant skilled human capital, which is a challenge for aforementioned countries and should be the major topic for aid for trade. How can these issues be addressed? So this is Elmer Mamadov, who had put this question. So Alice, if it's okay, because we have only 10-12 minutes left, maybe we can ask all our speakers to try to respond to that, as well as share any final insights they would like to, as I had kind of alerted them at the beginning, but we will request them, and they have been very disciplined. I'm very impressed and grateful. So if they can do it just in 1 minute each, Alice has a stopwatch, and as we know, Alice has a very persuasive way of getting people to do what she requests them to do. So is that okay, Alice? So, I mean, do we take the same order of speakers, or you want to go ahead with the?
Certainly, yes. Let's start with the same order of speakers, if you like, because I thought that was a really useful question, because it pulls out both the kind of the need to connect trade and environmental sustainability, but also brings in the extremely relevant question, which in fact the ambassador from Pakistan brought in also in his intervention, about human capacity, right? How much absorptive capacity do we have really in institutions, but also in the private sector? And so perhaps I'd be really interested in speakers' reactions to that question, kind of bringing this question of developing countries' priorities in this transition. One of them might well be focusing very much on building the capacity of their businesses and the capacity of their institutions to lead this transition, right, from within their own countries. So with that sort of frame, yes, let's go through from in the same order that you spoke. We'd be interested in your reactions to that and to other things that you've heard. Ambassador Blackman, please.
Thank you very much, Alice. Quite simply put, I think one of the things that we have to also, I think the question touched on the aspect of investment. And one of the things that became very clear through everyone's presentation today, the aspect of green finance. And therefore, that has to be now looked at in a more wholesome way. So therefore, every bit of investment, every bit of resources being thrown at it, as it were, now has to be seen through a green lens. Therefore, there must be a built-around agenda in that regard. But also in terms of the capacity building, yes, of course, we speak about the issue of businesses being in the transition mode. But one of the things that I've always said is that businesses are into making profit, but equally they understand the power of the consumer. And sometimes we have to take a step back and to see what strategy we can employ. And I think one of the things that will help the whole aspect of getting to where we want is if we can have consumers across the entire world, both developed countries and developing countries, who are acutely aware and understand the need for that green financing and green goods and green trade. That will drive the innovation and that will drive the financing, because the money will follow the demand of the market. So there are different ways, of course, policy, there's finance, but it also has to be that consumer awareness that will drive the entire process.
Super, thank you very much indeed. In fact, it's capacity building of consumers as well, then, isn't it? Quite right. Ambassador Piracha, this really chimes with an extremely interesting point you made. What would you like to respond to from what you've heard today?
So yes, I mean, from what I get out of it, I think at all levels, whether it's macro, whether it's global, whether it's national or micro, if you stick to the principle of that the polluters should be paying for the pollution they're causing, should be the key principle to keep in mind here. And I think it will work at all levels, because basically this is a question of behavioral change. And behavioral change can come around from carrots and sticks, both. Wider economic changes, of course, would require a lot of money, a lot of time. I don't know if we have that kind of time or money, you know, as the climate is changing so rapidly and and nature is disappearing so quickly and everything else. So it has to be a multi-frontal effort with some basic principles. But I think when it comes to just trade, then regulation, both stick and carrot, regulation national level, regulation perhaps at the multilateral level, which of course some players would resist, would be areas to look at. Thank you.
No, thank you very much indeed. And that brings the very interesting policy question of how do you achieve that behavioral change, right? And at what level do you act to achieve it? Yasmin, yours was almost one of the keynote presentations. What are your kind of reactions to what you've heard following your presentation?
Thank you so much. What I'm going to say is that the conclusion from my side is that we need to think of aid for trade from a futuristic perspective. And I think this is the challenge that we are facing post-COVID, particularly, where we all realized that we're heading towards a future which will change how trade looks like, but also where our climate is impacting considerably how we are producing and how we are trading. So if we get this futuristic perspective, we're not going to invest for only a short-term impact. We need to understand that a green aid for trade is investing for a future. I think this is very important for both sides, developing and developed countries, to keep in mind. And in this future, there are two key elements. Green goods and green services will gain more traction, just for the sake that we are realizing the impact of climate change on our lives. The more we realize it, the more the importance of those goods will increase, and the more there will be interest in trading in them. So there could be an economic interest. And the second thing is technology. We understood that digital services, digital trade will be of importance, is maybe the future, and might be, not necessarily, and this is another area to investigate, might be cleaner or greener if we focus on it and if we address this challenge from now. Which brings me to the three key balances in my presentation that we really need to strike. And that's having additional financial resources, keeping the same resources and asking aid for trade to become green and to consider environmental aspects will not be logic if we're looking for a brighter future for everyone. Also, support adaptation and resilience, because if we don't answer to the immediate needs for a resilient trade in developing countries that is capable to stop violent impact of climate change on our day-to-day production, then we won't have a future. And then the last thing is capacity building. And I think this is the most urgent. We're dealing with a topic that is still conceptualizing, both for developed countries and developing countries. And we need to agree that there is a lot to understand, a lot to research on, a lot to grasp, interests to understand, concerns and challenges to point to, and from both sides. And if developed countries have more capacities to do it, then we all know that developing countries and small developing countries won't have a chance if additional resources and capacity building is not provided. And I will stop there. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. Very useful. And I very much like the focus on the balances. Ambassador Manley, you were next on the list. Reactions to what you've heard, and perhaps this focus on building human capacity, not for where we are, but for where we want to be in 20 or 50 years.
I'd like to kind of bring it back to actually the question that Alma Mamedov asked in the chat. And I'd agree with a lot, particularly what Yasmin's just said about the way that we need to look at all this. Although we don't have a lot of time, right? There's a danger that we could spend the next 10, 15 years perfecting our approaches, only to find that the world's no longer there to save. So almost absolutely right, and kind of others have hinted about the scale here. And that poses a real challenge. Yeah? It poses a real challenge for the donor community, it poses a real challenge for recipients. And if we continue as we are going currently, we will not be able to achieve that scale of investment. And so you have to absolutely right, as others have said, that we need to be working out how we green aid for trade. But we also need to see that within the context of how we mobilize resources more effectively across the piece. As you touched on it in terms of the way that we engage with the private sector in particular. And I think without kind of blowing the trumpet too much for our international development strategy, that is what we're trying to get at in it, which is how do you actually make a sort of a difference of scale? And it comes back to some of the things that Chad was saying about the sheer scale of investment that's needed in SIDS in particular, some of the most vulnerable countries on the planet, if we are to achieve our net zero goals across the world. And that for us is why you need to have an approach that really brings in business, that brings in the sovereign wealth funds, that brings in private investors, that unlocks just a portion of the vast funds that are out there in managed assets managed by investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. And that is for us why at the very heart of our international development strategy is that notion of collaboration between private and public. It's why that we've launched our British investment partnerships, and of course within those partnerships, why we have our Clean Green Initiative, Just Energy Transition partnerships, such as the one that we've already agreed with South Africa, where we want to provide a platform effectively for low and middle income partners to work with climate finance donors, to work with international financial institutions, to work with private investors to achieve that just energy transition and to mobilize the resources that are out there, but which we are not currently tapping effectively enough.
Very interesting. And particularly picking up this question of partnerships then gives me the perfect excuse maybe to give Carolyn and Stephen, if you don't mind, 60 seconds, an extra challenge to talk a little bit about partnerships and how we achieve this scale up, and to react to other things you've heard. Perhaps Carolyn first. Go ahead.
Thanks, Alice. I'm going to be super quick to defer to Stephen, but the key point I did want to make is we have just started to touch more on the role of other stakeholders, particularly from the private sector, and their role as part of this huge challenge of mobilizing resources. But I do think it's important not to forget other types of stakeholders, such as the research community and also NGOs in developing countries, who are some of those who are really at the forefront of driving change, and also represent some of the durable institutions that are really worth investing in, so that there's real long-term capacity. So you hear less from people like me and more from people like Yasmin from countries around the world as well, articulating the kind of priorities and agenda that they have. So with that, I will cede to Stephen.
Super. Stephen.
Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, I would totally agree with you. And I would also say the science community as well. I mean, there was a very interesting development at UNEA, which was the Science Policy Panel on Pollution Prevention, Chemicals and Waste. This is the EPBS, or the INFCCC equivalent for climate on pollution. So there's some very interesting developments there. Just two thoughts from my end, Alice and colleagues. I was at Stockholm about a month ago, Stockholm Plus 50. That was 50 years before UNEP was born, that created UNEP. And two things I took away from it. On finance, which was part of the question, we need to align and expand. So we need to expand, but we also need to align. And here I was really encouraged to hear Ambassador Manley talk about, in the UK, they are totally committed to aligning their finance, their ODA finance. The second thing I took away from Stockholm was youth. It really is about youth. And when I think about capacities, I think about youth and what are the skills that youth need for the future. I think we need to listen. The ambassador from Pakistan was very clear about that nascent informal economy. We need to build on what's there. My last thought is building on what's there. MC12, you know, the WTO pulled out a success. I was so pleased to see, and you got fish subsidies across the line. We need to strengthen those institutions which guard and steward the public good, like the WTO. So those are my final thoughts. And I would say aid for trade. You can put it into the same basket. Thanks, Alice. Back over to you.
Absolutely. No, those were super. Aligning and expanding. And I think a lot of people in this last 90 minutes have been talking exactly about how we might do that. I've been overwhelmed by the challenge of this, but also at the end quite inspired that we do have a sense of where we might go next. So thank you very much to all of the speakers, and thank you, Assam, for the fantastic question, which prompted a really interesting round of discussion to close this off. But the very last word goes to my erstwhile colleague, Rashid. Rashid, the closing words are yours.
Thank you very much, Alice. I'm glad that you did not ask me a question, so that leaves me some room to say what I want to say. I will be brief. It's very, very difficult to capture the essence of this very rich, very, I would call productive as well, and substantive conversation that we had. So let me pick some of the things that are very fresh or lodged into my mind, probably more than others. Every challenge is an opportunity. So our challenge here, because of climate change and pollution, is one of the greatest challenges that humanity has ever faced. So one can hope that that can be turned into a really equally big opportunity for connected, sustained, inclusive trade and development. That means that we need to try to make trade part of the solution and not part of the problem to aggravate the challenge. But that's where it is also important to see that in a number of developing countries, there may not be very sophisticated theoretical conceptual frameworks, but there are practices existing from generations or new, and one cannot and must not ignore that to integrate them into thinking, and then integrating them from the highest level of policy to the practical examples. Because ultimately for that, we need to connect the dots, various dots. That's where aid for trade becomes not an super hero, but a part of a larger problematic, part of a larger solution there, where we have climate finance, we have technology mechanism, we have private sector contributing because the needs are great. So the connecting the dots with a view to, as you were all saying, to align them and to expand them. And final outcome that we are looking at is a behavioral change, which is not again limited to at any individual level. It is about, of course, individual behavioral changes in developing and developed countries, that change at the business model and enterprise level, that change at MNC level, that change at the governmental policy level, and that change at the international level, let's say, as some of you were mentioning, at the WTO level. And in all of that, key question is that, key important point is that the capacity building, the needs of developing countries to be able to do that are enormous. And for that, alignment is, of course, important, but also expansion of various levels, from the available resources, from the existing resources to new resources, from the existing available resources to additional resources, from more known ways of delivering to more innovative ways of delivering, from low technology to high technology. So all of that need to expand. I'm sorry if I'm losing a bit of a coherence here, because there was, I said, a lot of rich ideas there. But the good thing is that I think they were connecting. That's my sense there. So it was wonderful to hear. You have given us a lot of food for thought, and to the participants as well. And I'm sure that we will be working more also. And I'm sure both LSU and Caroline and Yasmin getting ideas for future work already here. So wonderful. So with that, if it's okay, Alice, can I thank them and allow them to go home? Okay. So yeah, so thank you very much, everyone. First of all, the participants for staying with us till the end, joining us from different parts of the world. And of course, many thanks to our excellent 6 panelists. You did a fantastic job, very clear, very substantive. And of course, in a spirit of partnership. It was the way you presented ideas, commented, it gives a more holistic picture. And then, of course, my very sincere thanks to all the colleagues who put this session together, from Tess colleagues, Caroline, Michael, Dipashri, then, of course, colleagues at IIST, LSU in particular, colleagues at FCDO, Kathleen, you in particular, and then, of course, my own colleagues at CUTS, Yasmin in particular, and Julia. So with very warm thanks to you, we wish you well, wish you good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And those of you who are following Aid for Trade, wishing you another good day of this global review. And if I can take just 30 seconds to advertise, we have another session by CUTS and Mission of Fiji, looking at the synergies between climate finance and Aid for Trade. That is early morning tomorrow from 8:30 till 9:30 virtually. So best wishes to all of you, and goodbye from our side.